Bravely Default and Bravely Second are two of the finest JRPGs on the 3DS in my opinion. Having only just finished the two previous games last year, I was incredibly excited and hyped to play through this game. So does Bravely Default 2 meet my expectation, or does it compound the series fatigue feeling I was starting to feel with the franchise? Welcome to TisIsReal, where I talk about all things video games. In this video, I'll be reviewing Bravely Default 2 for the Nintendo Switch. Bravely Default 2's story is nothing to write home about, featuring a lot of narrative cliches and JRPG tropes, like starting the game out with washing up on shore, the party being the heroes of light, and the quest being that you need to retrieve the stolen magical elemental crystals. It's a classic tale that clearly harkens back to the old JRPG roots. It's worth noting that Bravely Default 2's story is not linked with the first two games, so newcomers do not worry, you can play through this game with zero knowledge and context of what transpired in the universe of the two earlier games. Speaking of the earlier games, comparing Bravely Default 2's plot to Bravely Second, I found that the story uniformly feels less ambitious, and the story beats, emotional scenes and character development all felt weaker compared to Bravely Second. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a serviceable plot. It is not distractingly bad in any way, and this serviceable writing does still instill a sense of motivation for players to want to carry on the game journey. And what starts up as a simple plot does eventually start to spire into something a little more grand scale. And one good thing I can say about the journey is that it's really well paced, with story sequences, exploration and boss battles packed really nicely together. This is unlike the original Bravely Default game, which was often flagged in its late game for its incredibly repetitive pacing leading up to the finale. And do take note that there is one thing that has the potential to break out the pacing of the game, and that is the side quests. Generally, the side quests featured here are horrible. Most of them are mere fetch and kill quests, with lots of boring writing to justify the quests. This reminds me of another JRPG that I recently finished, being Xenoblade Chronicles, where the boring side quests featured can break out the pacing of the main story. Anyway, this is a huge letdown for me, as both Bravely Default and Bravely Second featured really good side quests, especially those found in Bravely Second, as they usually provide very interesting events, writing and entertaining characters, as well as just giving unique perspective on the world. Not to forget, the reward type for finishing those quests often included new jobs, which definitely weighs more than the rewards received here. Anyways, the story and plot was never the reason why the Bravely Default series was great. The Immaculate gameplay is what fans like us are really looking for, and I'm happy to report Bravely Default 2 gameplay is as excellent as the other games. The combat system remains one of the best among its contemporaries. What really sets this combat system apart from all the others are the two commands Brave and Default. For the uninitiated, let me briefly explain how the combat system works. Each character has a resource known as the BP, where one can hold up to a maximum of 3 BP. By choosing to default, you give out the turn by adopting a defensive stun. In return, you will gain a BP. When you choose to Brave, you are able to do multiple actions at an exchange of 1 BP each. You are able to Brave a maximum of 3 times, granting you 4 actions in just a single turn. The key thing to note is that you are allowed to go into negative BP, but in return you have to pay it back by being a sitting duck where you cannot move for the same amount of turns. This system allows for a dizzying level of depth that really balances risk and reward really well. Just to show an example, in this early battle, I was facing against a white mage, who specializes in healing magic. So in this scenario, if I don't spend multiple BPs in a single turn, I may not be able to burst her down in one turn. So she can easily just heal back all the damage I dealt when it came to her turn, effectively nulling all the damage I did. So in this case, I took the risk to go into negative BP to try to burst her down. You're often required to constantly make this kind of difficult decision all the time, and the amount of BP you have is a crucial factor to take note of when you're making these decisions. Like in this case, I was initially saving up on Seth's special skill to use on the main boss himself. However, because of the current dire situation, where 3 of my party members are essentially sitting ducks due to negative BP, I have to waste my special skills to ensure a KO on one of the boss's allied enemies, so as not to sustain that much damage during the next few turns where 3 of my party members are basically sitting ducks. And as you can see, I barely avoided a party wipeout and game over. And of course, another reason why the combat system is so fun is because your enemies also has access to the same Brave and Default commands. Of course, the normal enemies aren't as potent as the bosses when it comes down to using this system to its fullest. And the high points of the game are definitely during these boss battles. It's in these battles where your mental as a strategist is put to the test. Most of the boss battles are encounters against asterisk holders, which are the different job holders. For instance, just now I showcased an early boss battle against a white mage and a vanguard. Since they are holders of this job, many of their encounters are designed with specific strategies and gimmicks, and if you are not ready for them, it can lead to easy game overs. Speaking of not being ready for them, the most controversial new mechanic of these battles in this game are the counter attacks. In this game, enemies can get the ability to counter attack when you do a certain action. As you might imagine, this is more of a factor during boss battles. The counter attacks trigger vary from bosses to bosses. For example, it can be triggered when you attack him with physical attacks, or if you use white magic abilities. It can get a lot more creative as you progress. Actions such as defaulting, casting buffs, or doing anything can get you countered. And my feelings regarding this mechanic are kind of mixed. On one end, it adds an additional strategic element to consider during the proceedings, as now you're basically handicapped in the sense that you are discouraged in doing that particular action. And it can add quite a bit of excitement to the battles since the counter are not guaranteed to happen. For example, I remember doing one boss battle, the boss itself counters white magic. But if my white mage gets countered in that one turn and is unable to get her white magic off, the battle will be over. Which thankfully in that scenario, that counter didn't trigger. Okay, but for the other end, not gonna lie, this mechanic can feel bloody unfair. It's effectively a free turn for the boss to do some damage, or just apply status effect. And not to forget, if you're using the brave commands, multiple counters can trigger at one go. I've lost quite a few battles just due to this one mechanic, and it feels terrible every time, resulting in many salty moments.
All is over to his divine guidance.
And the difficulty of this game deserves mention. I have to say it was really difficult in the first 15 hours of the game, and that has to mainly do with the fact that there just isn't that much jobs and abilities unlocked at the start. But the difficulty curve slowly tapers towards the mid-game, where with a greater selection of jobs and abilities, there are now multiple solutions to each ensuing boss battles, and most of the time I can just kind of brute force through these fights with better items and equipment. Then the last 7 hours of the game, the difficulty picked up a little, but it was still manageable, as my main party configuration has basically come to its own at that point. Now, the previous games also had this difficulty spike near the start of the game. I think it's perfectly reasonable, as I was just getting used to the battle system and whatnot. But this time round, I felt that the difficulty spike felt a little bit too steep. I've gotten stuck with multiple bosses in the early stages a lot more times, resulting in multiple game overs. And I think the reason why it felt so steep is because the boss battles in this game can last up to 40 minutes or so, which just compounded the dread feeling of retrying again. Seriously, some of the bosses are just so damn hard. But here's the kicker, even though I have to retry some bosses a few times here and there, I never found myself needing to grind. I often just needed a change in the combination of equipment, jobs, abilities, and overall strategy to get the job done in the end. I don't understand the overly criticized point that the game is very grindy. In fact, I'm pretty sure I was underleveled throughout the entire game. The game really tests you more on strategy rather than just raw numbers and stats. Speaking of strategy, the job system makes a return here in Bravely Default 2, spotting some new changes and improvement. For the uninitiated, in Bravely Default 2, you are able to equip both a main job and a sub job, granting you an extra set of abilities to the level you learn it in your sub job. For example, you can have Elvis spot a main job of Black Mage, while still being able to cast white magic spells up to the level it learned its white magic job. Since in this case, my Elvis never equipped white magic job before, it is only at level 1, which only grants access to the white magic spell Cure. But nevertheless, it still came in useful during this early game. One of the few improvements that is not stated enough is that gaining job points is so much easier. I find myself learning way more job abilities at a faster rate than the previous 2 games. This is the primary reason why I never have to sit down somewhere and grind, cause the job points earned feels so much easier and quicker. Overall, this change gives you the incentive to try and experiment with different jobs at every point of the game. Whereas compared to Bravely 2nd and Bravely Default, the JP games are very slow, so what ended up happening in those games was, it wasn't worth it trying to deviate that much. It makes you stick to the tried and true, as unlocking the later abilities in the job is far more important than trying a brand new build. In this game, however, I find myself at least considering changing jobs often, either to just get the passive abilities or maybe just for a particularly tough fight. In addition, JP Ops are new items that gives you job points anytime you want. It essentially cut down needing to grind job levels by half, and they are not very hard to find during your journey. With all of this improvement, it's so much better to try out new builds and strategies no matter what point of the game you are at. And this is a great thing, as mixing and matching different jobs is one of the best parts of the franchise. With that being said, it boggles my mind that the favorites feature from Bravely 2nd is for some reason not included. For the uninitiated, the favorites feature in Bravely 2nd allows you to create up to 10 different loadouts, which aid in the process of equipping different jobs, abilities and equipment as fast as possible, as seamlessly as possible. I honestly have no idea why the feature was omitted in this release, especially since equipment this time round has been a huge hassle. The newly added weight stat makes it so hard to pick the right gear for each party member. It's crazy how some of the better equipment just can't be equipped, without rearranging the other pieces of the equipment. It's honestly such a troubling process. I often just rely on the automatic equipment feature, which saves me lots of headaches. I get that this is probably done to balance the equipment, but nevertheless the execution left much to be desired. Anyways, the jobs themselves are a joy to mess around. Most of the old jobs have updates to its kit and movesets, which incite new strategies and playstyles. The new jobs are also generally really fun to mess around with. Of course, part of the fun in this system is mixing and matching different party builds together through clever consideration in jobs, passive abilities and equipment. For instance, once you reach level 9 as a white mage, you will gain the passive ability Drain Attack, which restores an amount of HP based on damage inflicted with the attack command. Of course, as you can probably tell, this passive ability probably doesn't suit a white mage that well, since most of the time a white mage rarely ever use the attack command. This is where you might want to equip this passive ability to a job where its primary duty is to spam attack commands, giving him or her basically free heals every time he or she attacks. This time round, you also gain a second passive specialty when you max out a job, which adds another consideration when planning builds. On my playthrough, I didn't really find any super duper OP combos to exploit, but just looking around the subreddit for Bravely Default, it seems you already have fallen in love with a particular move. Suffice to say, the customization and combat system makes the gameplay very deep and rewarding, perfect for both returning and new fans alike to sink their teeth into. Outside of battles, Square Enix has also changed some parts of the gameplay experience. The most noticeable change that I found was the removal of random encounters. On paper, it will sound like a really good change, as random encounters are considered outdated design in a JRPG. However, in practice, I found that the normal encounters are so much more of a hassle in this game than the previous games. Enemies are very fast and will most likely initiate combat as soon as they see you. Especially since I was underleveled the entire game, they will constantly chase me around. Whereas in the two previous games, the developers gave us a quality of life option in terms of the random encounter slider, which gave us the freedom to dictate the amount of encounters we want. This was a great option as it let us fight enemies at our own pace and it doesn't impede exploration since we can just turn it all the way down. Some of you guys might be wondering, is this really such a big problem though? Especially since there is a specific item known as the Ward Light which repels those enemies from engaging in battles. Well, if the encounters are the only thing that changed, I guess it wouldn't feel that bad. However, another reason why the dungeons felt draggy and uninteresting is the lack of a map. I have no idea why they removed the dungeon map feature. It makes exploration such a big pain. I can't describe how frustrating navigating the dungeon feels. Coupled with the numerous enemies encounter, sometimes exploration will be broken up by maybe 3 minutes of battles, and by the end of the battle, you have no idea where you are going or where the treasure box you just saw before the encounter was. I really hope in the future they just add the dungeon map back. Anyway, they also added an exploration mode which allows you to collect items when the Nintendo Switch is in sleep mode. This mode is great as the items collected include the aforementioned JP Ops, which circumvents grinding, so yeah, it's pretty neat. There's also a card game known as B&D, which is probably inspired by the Triple Triad card game from Final Fantasy VIII. I find it to be quite fun at the beginning, but after its introduction quest, I kind of just didn't really bother with it anymore, but I guess it's worth mentioning. Speaking of things that are worth mentioning, the music in this game is absolutely fire. Revo from the first Bravely Default game has graced us yet again with an incredible score from start to finish. The standout tracks are definitely the myriad of battle themes which feature very techno and rock vibes. To avoid spoiling any musical surprises, I'll just say that the battle tracks featured in the later stages of the game are definitely absolutely a delight to listen to, covering many leitmotifs from the 2 previous games and other Final Fantasy games that is sure to delight longtime fans of the series as well as Final Fantasy fans. As a fan myself, I had to resist my urge to go and listen to the final boss theme before getting there. And I'm glad I did, cause I received the same goosebumps inducing feeling while listening to the final boss theme. While the music was the clear highlight of the presentation, the graphics are one big mixed bag. Overall, I have to say the developers did a good job translating the Bravely Default signature graphical style from the 3DS to the Switch. This is most noticeable in the town sections where it has the same sense of grand stature in its design and look, and these areas look really good in both handheld and dock mode. And that's pretty much all the praise I have regarding the graphics. The overworld and dungeons are just flat out boring to look at sometimes. I mean, just look at the overworld for yourself. Does it not look boring? It feels very man-made and unnatural. Comparing this to Octopath Traveler more linear pathways and dungeons, the difference is night and day. The lighting is better, the atmosphere feels better. I also feel that the few cutscenes featured are also pretty mediocre, and that is basically fueled by the character model's design. I find that the models are less animated than the ones found in Bravely Default and Bravely Second, and as a result, it kind of feels less cute. And also the models give us this very plastic look that I'm not a fan of. The performance is also not as smooth as I would have hoped. The game likes to chuck for a few seconds here and there. Like one very clear instance is navigating through the menus. It almost always lags when opening the menu. Another example is initiating conversations with NPCs or opening a party chat. It will lag for a second or two. Now, I'll preface by saying the performance drop down is never really a big deal, especially since this is only just a command turn-based game, so a few frame drops here and there will not sour the gameplay experience. But what it does is it adds to a prevailing feeling of unpolishedness to the experience. And this feeling continues to permeate as I got to the finale. A question was always on the back of my head: was this game rushed? Since this game was delayed, and we all know the turbulent development cycle of 2020, and overall it has lesser content than the first two games. To summarize, just like its predecessors, Bravely Default 2 is a great standalone game that continues to pay homage to the iconic JRPGs of old, retaining the excellent Brave and Default combat system while still trying to evolve the battle system by adding in new mechanics like the controversial counter-attacks. As such, the boss battles are the best part of the game, almost always providing an intense and challenging time, where each victory, either through clever strategy or cheese, all felt extremely rewarding. The refinements of the job system, such as making it easier to gain job levels, makes the job system feel more free and welcoming to constant mixing and matching throughout the entire game. This game is also accompanied by a very high quality soundtrack that I'm sure long-time fans will truly appreciate. The negatives are the story and plot are very mediocre, with weaker story beats and character development compared to the first two games. In addition, the side quests here are very bad, mainly just old boring fetch and kill quests, which once again fall short when compared to the first two games. Some quality of life options and mechanics are strangely missing as well, such as a loadout option like the favorites feature from Bravely Second, and no dungeon map, causing each dungeon to feel very draggy. Performance can sometimes chuck here and there, resulting in the game feeling unpolished. With all that being said, even though there might seem to be a lot of negatives, I'm giving Bravely Default 2 a 9 out of 10. Although the pros do not fully counter all the cons, I would say I enjoy tinkering with the job system, and when it comes down to the combat, it's just immaculate. Every time I defeat another tough, difficult boss, my adrenaline shoots right back up. Ultimately, Bravely Default 2 is a game that met my expectation but did not surpass them. As such, I'll only recommend Bravely Default 2 to fans of the genre where you only care about the combat and gameplay. Skip this game if you want to experience a well-told original plot. I really hope for Bravely Default 3, Square Enix will really try to evolve the whole franchise by putting more effort into its story and plot and ironing out all the other issues, just like how Final Fantasy games have continued to evolve over the years. Anyways, let me know in the comment section below what are your thoughts on Bravely Default 2, and if you want to know my opinion on the first two Bravely games, you can watch it right here. For more JRPGs review, subscribe to this channel at TisIsReal. So long guys, so long.